It's now my privilege to hand it over to Govind Iyer, who's a managing partner of Egon Zehnder in India and a long-time SVP partner, and he is going to run the final session. So over to you, Govind.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm still catching my breath actually after that fantastic story by Alina, and I've heard that many times over, but every time it's so amazing, Alina. Thank you very much, and thank you for Mark running a very good panel. I'd like to now move to the last session of the day. It's been a thought-provoking day for me, and I'm sure for many others, hearing all the lovely stories. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll go on to probably 8 o'clock. We'll focus on building institutions of social change. That's really going to be the focus of this session. We have a very diverse panel with very rich global and Indian experiences, and I'm hoping that will all come through for us to take away some key learnings. What is amazing is that all 4 of them have been engaged philanthropists for many decades, and so there's a lot of learning that we can learn from them and bring to our own causes. Each of them will share their personal stories, which I'm sure will be very interesting and inspirational. So let me start with Anu. Anu Aga is someone who has inspired me for many years with her desire to really make the world a much better place. She retired as the chair of Thermax and in 2004, and then over the last 15 years has focused on social causes. She's very keenly involved with 2 of the best run NGOs I know in the country, Akanksha and Teach for India, which promote education for the underprivileged. Over to you, Anu. Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, and that'll allow us some Q&A at the end of the session. So over to you, Anu.
Thanks, my dear friends, Govind and Ganesh, for inviting me. Today, from my personal experience, I would like to talk about the power of value-based quality education and its ability to transform the lives of underprivileged students from urban slums. Let me give you a little background about the 2 NGOs I've been associated with since their inception. The first NGO is Akanksha. It was started in Mumbai almost 30 years ago by a dynamic young girl of 18 who lived abroad and came to Mumbai to visit her grandparents. On her trip, she paid a visit to the slums of the city. Seeing the children around her, their immense potential and their immense suffering made her realize that she couldn't return to her college in the US. She moved to India and founded Akanksha, that is now 30 years old. I wonder whether we who live in India get insensitive to poverty and all its problems. Today, Akanksha has 21 schools between Pune and Mumbai for the slum children who are denied, deprived, and the basics of life and discriminated against. The second organization is Teach for India, a fellowship model that recruits India's best and brightest young graduates to teach for 2 years in municipal and low-income schools instead of joining corporate India. Over the last 10 years, 120,000 young Indians have applied for the fellowship and 3,400 have completed it. Teach for India today serves 32,000 low-income children through their fellowship. Even more powerful, through the 3,400 alumni are impacted tens of millions. More powerful than the numbers are the stories from both these organizations. Meet Seema. Seema lives in an overcrowded, filthy slum in Mumbai with her mother and 2 brothers. Thanks to Akanksha, she did very well in school while her 2 brothers dropped out from municipal schools. He went on to graduate and applied to TFI, which takes 7% of applicants to join the fellowship program, and creates a new generation of India's leaders through the experience of achieving success in difficult classrooms. After her graduation, Seema joined as a teacher in an Akanksha school and rose to be its principal. Priyanka, the only child to her parents, comes from a family where the father is serving a life sentence for murder and her mother is struggling to eke out a living. Priyanka, by her influence of TFI, made it to the United World College in Italy on full scholarship and is right now studying in one of the US universities, again on full scholarship. Education is magic through which both these NGOs have created many Seemas and many Priyankas. Though coming from the poorest of backgrounds, they do not want to pursue a corporate career, but choose to join a social sector and make a difference in the lives of the poor. With 73 million Indians living in extreme poverty and more than 60% of India's 350 million children destined never to attend school, we need thousands of fellows of young people committed to reform and to transform this dismal scenario. Let me tell you a few stories of these fellows. Saurabh graduated from the prestigious IIT Delhi and had a very well-paid corporate job. He gave that up to join the fellowship. After spending 2 years in a government school in Mumbai, he decided not to return to the corporate world. Instead, he worked in Akanksha as a principal and was chosen as the CEO of Akanksha 3 years ago, making a huge difference in the lives of 10,000 students. Coming from a middle-class background, Soumya completed his master's in the US and got a job there, whereby he could afford all the luxuries he had dreamt about, including a Mercedes car. He felt a strong urge to return to India and do something meaningful for the poor. He chucked up everything and returned to India with his wife, and after 2 years of completing his fellowship, created an NGO called I Teach, providing free education to the poor by starting English medium schools in Pune from 8th standard to 10th standard. There are 3,400 of these stories, 3,400 Saurabhs and Soumyas. They are trying to change India's educational system so we all have a better tomorrow. Hence, I strongly believe that education is the most important antidote to bridge the inequity gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu. That was fantastic, those two stories. And we'll have, I'm sure, more questions around those as we go along. I'll now like to move to Paul. Paul Shoemaker from the US. He's had a 30-year career that spanned many entrepreneurial ventures and working with large multinational organizations. And then in 1998, he left Microsoft to start SVP in Seattle as the founding president. He's been regarded as one of the 50 most influential executives in the not-for-profit sector, spoken many times at TEDx and United Nations events, and even written for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, Fortune, and the Huffington Post. Paul is going to talk to us a little bit about sharing his views on leadership in the next decade and how he sees the social sector going forward. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Govind. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you. And just a nod to the great work that you folks have done in India, SVP spread to all over the world. And I don't think there's been anywhere that's been more sort of enthusiastic, at a greater sort of stronger trajectory than SVP India has. So it's very exciting. Wonderful to be here with you early in the morning in Seattle. My comments start from a basic premise, which is leadership always matters. It always has, it always will. And I believe that in the times that we live in, leadership is going to matter even more than it ever has before. Just a little bit of context, and you've heard it throughout the conference today. We definitely live in a world of inequities and inequalities that we're all working on to try to close. And yet some of the economic and social and health inequities in our countries, they continue to grow. Anu just did a great job of describing some of those inequities in India. So at the same time, we're bringing some people up out of poverty. On the other end of the spectrum, we're also creating more inequity because we have more folks with more and more wealth and less folks sort of able to attain that wealth. So that's context for me. And by the way, of course, in America, we have this other inequity called politics, which hopefully we're going to try to settle in 39 days from now, but I won't talk about that. At the same time we have these inequities in our societies, we also have these just major amplifiers. Technology can do wonderful, great things. It also creates massive inequities in the access to and the usage of it. And then, of course, there's this thing called COVID. And that pandemic has become one of the greatest amplifiers of inequities possible in every part of the world. It's played out in different ways in different parts of the world, but the degree to which COVID amplified inequities is just undeniable, and it's going to take a long, long time to work back from. So what this says to me is we're going to need leadership in a way we've never had it before. It's going to demand particular qualities out of us even more than they were before. And it also means that leadership is going to come from different places and different kinds of people. It isn't just going to be a person in an organization with a title. It's going to be people out in communities, people in neighborhoods, civic leaders, nonprofit leaders, and corporate leaders that are willing to engage across sectors. So, and as I talk to you also, the other comment I would make is when you think of leadership, don't just think about an individual person, think about it as a team, and then think about it as the whole organization. So leadership can sort of exist at many levels and many forms. So the three qualities I want to just spotlight, highlight briefly are, number one, in the world that we live in and that I just briefly described, I think authenticity of the leader is going to just be massive. Just the word itself says a lot about it. Authenticity means just blatant honesty. We live in a world of radical transparency. Everything is out there. So if you're going to be a leader, you don't have any choice. You're going to have to be out there. You're going to have to be visible. And you better show up authentically. And your authenticity needs to be proactive, not just responsive, if you will. So I think number one, authenticity, I call it 24/7 authenticity, is going to become more and more significant in the world. The second of the three qualities I would highlight is a capacity for complexity. We all have challenges, no matter what part of the world we live in. I'd say for the States for sure, and I think in many parts of the world, I think the challenges we face in the decade ahead are greater than any challenge we have faced in a long, long time. In the States, I'd say it's the greatest challenge we've faced since World War II. And these challenges and problems we have these days, they're not just sort of like simple, linear, check the box kinds of problems. They are non-linear, non-sequential. What that means is that some of the solutions in the past, they're not going to apply to the future. It also means you have to be able to not only take in a lot of information, you have to be able to process it and play that complexity back out in a way to help solve problems. And the other comment I'll make about complexity and having the ability to deal with complex problems, and I've experienced this time and time again in my career, there better be women in the room. And I mean that sincerely. They are better at dealing with complex problems than men are. That's my opinion. We all have our strengths and our weaknesses. But I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of men, and if the problem wasn't sort of like simple and straightforward, the ability to solve it was less because there weren't these different kinds of minds and thinking in the room. The last quality I'll highlight is cross-sector fluency. And by that, what I mean is there's a public sector, there's a social nonprofit sector, and there's a private sector. And those sectors are bleeding together. The challenges we have, sort of cut across those sectors. We're going to need more and more people that don't just sort of jump out of one sector and back into their normal one, but are literally fluent across all three of those sectors. And when you look at the challenges we're trying to solve, the nonprofit sector is going to need the private sector sort of trust and capital. The public sector needs the nonprofit sector because they know how to solve problems. And the private sector has capital and scale, but they need those other two sectors because they actually know how to go about working in communities. So all those sectors are going to need each other. And people that have what I call cross-sector fluency, they're going to be critical leaders. And I think they're going to be the kinds of people that can bring those sectors together and sort of provide that glue. And I would leave you with, again, I would emphasize that leadership, I think, always have and it always will matter. And I think the kinds of leaders it's going to take are the kinds of people that are on this conference that are in SVP, because you are going down that path of cross-sector fluency. You're going down that path of dealing with complexity and showing up authentically in the world. So thank you for being here today. It's great to share the time with you all.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those perspectives on leadership for now and the future. I'd now like to move to Sofia. Sofia serves as the deputy director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the philanthropic partnership team, whose mission it is to encourage and engage more intentionally giving by all, getting many more people to give. In fact, Sofia, this morning session, which you wouldn't have been part of, started by Pramod Bhasin, one of the other speakers, talking about the Living My Promise movement in India, which, as you know about, is a little bit like what you do at the Giving Pledge in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as part of that. She's also part of leading the Giving Pledge movement and around the world, which is a public commitment by the world's wealthiest individuals and couples to give majority of their wealth to charitable causes. And finally, most importantly, Sofia is the board chair of SVP International, and would love for her to share her perspectives on how philanthropy has evolved over the years and how she sees it going forward.
Thank you, Govind, for inviting me to join this panel, and thank you to the previous speakers. I'm just so inspired to be with you early in the morning Seattle time, as Paul mentioned. And thank you to Ganesh Natarajan, who's been a valued member of the SVPI board. In addition, I know, to being a leader within the SVP India network and as your board chair. So just a little on my personal story. You know, I went to law school many years ago with a social justice mission in mind. I wanted to use my skills and apply my career to be focused on promoting greater equality and focused on historically marginalized individuals. And yet I came out of law school and found myself working at a corporate law firm representing actually emerging technology companies. And it wasn't until 2001, post 9/11, that I came back to my original personal mission. And I learned that actually there were a lot of others out there with a similar passion to mine, and I discovered the venture philanthropy field. Fast forward 5 years from then, and I was working at SVP Seattle alongside my fellow panelist, Paul Shoemaker, whom you just heard from. And 7 years after working at SVP Seattle, I then joined the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to work on the Giving Pledge, which Govind mentioned. And I now lead that team. And I share that kind of background in sort of my personal journey because I see a lot of similarities across the various networks of donors that I've engaged with, that people are really hungry and wanting to discover their purpose and find a deeper meaning in their lives and make a difference on the deep inequities they see around them. And I just so relate to that personally. So this panel, you know, about building institutions for social impact, I really think about how the last 25 years has seen a big shift in philanthropy, and it feels like really we're in the middle of another big shift. So I want to share just a few of my observations around some of those trends and also some of my hopes for where philanthropy is going in the years to come. So, you know, just one of the big shifts that we've seen in the last 20 years is this growth of engaged donors and venture philanthropy, which I mentioned, just people giving more than money, giving their time, giving their skills, and having a desire to pull together, both for learning and for greater social impact. And SVP really exemplifies this. And in my own journey, going from corporate to social impact, which has been hugely transformative to me to be part of SVP, one of the things I've really learned is the value of community among donors, but importantly, the need for donors to listen to communities, to build trust, and not come in with all the answers or assuming a business mindset will solve everything. And I've heard that, you know, also from in some of the stories from the other speakers that I got to hear, putting communities first, and the other messages from the previous panel, which I got to hear just the end of. And the Gates Foundation is also a highly engaged donor in a slightly different way, but they also face challenges that come with being such a big donor. How do you work in partnership and in a way that empowers communities and in some of this work building institutions? And one of Melinda's core beliefs is that we need to center all of our solutions on women and take the work on building up kind of public health systems and the global health programs of the Gates Foundation, for example. And one of the lessons learned is really paying attention to gender and other social barriers to positive social health outcomes. So sometimes one can think about technical health interventions like a vaccine or therapeutic treatment, and there's a need to look holistically and understand women's lives and design interventions with women at the center, and also see the connection with health and women's education and women's economic empowerment. And so that's been part of the Gates Foundation's journey over the last 20 years. I also look at philanthropic institutions themselves around the topic of this panel and seeing some shifts in those. And one is an accelerated time horizon. So over the last 20 years, more donors who do start foundations seem to be doing it with a time limit in mind and a greater urgency. They want to get the money out the door some number of years after their death, or in some cases spend down in their lifetime. Paul Brainerd, the original founder of SVP Seattle, is an example of that, and he wound down his foundation, sunsetting it this year. Chuck Feeney, the duty-free billionaire who's a Giving Pledge signer and started Atlantic Philanthropy, signed dissolution papers for his foundation last week, having given away over $8 billion. And really, even just in the last five to 10 years, donors seem to be starting even earlier in their giving. You know, really wanting to get started in their 20s and 30s while they're still building their careers and their companies. And donor networks will really need to speak to a younger audience, given that, you know, interest from younger donors. The other trend I'd talk about is a growth of alternatives to starting a traditional foundation, and in particular, a growing number of aggregated pooled funding vehicles that are working at large scale to address social problems. And so many of them have emerged just in the last 10 years, and in the last 20 years raised a total of $4 billion in philanthropic capital. And so can this marketplace of collaborative giving vehicles to scale and address social problems collectively become more the norm? And even if it doesn't replace foundations, could this become something that's in every philanthropist's portfolio? And then I guess just my final thoughts on what I hope to see more of. You know, one is just hearing more conversations about systems change and advocacy, and I really hope I'll see more action in the years to come around that. Another thing I hope to see more of is donors sharing power more intentionally. And as a network, SVP has really a great opportunity to be a leader in the philanthropic sector around some of these changes, like power sharing, and being a proponent of giving now and giving more in order to better meet the needs of our nonprofit partners and communities, giving more to leaders of color, women leaders, and give in ways that center the people and the organizations closest to the challenges we're facing. And to go beyond this moment of COVID and sustain practices that address fundamental systemic changes in order to heal our communities and our world. SVP International has launched a Reimagine initiative as one of these efforts. And our overarching goal is to foster greater networking and collective action to move philanthropy in this direction of real and just social change. And we have a first tactical step around a Reimagine fund, inviting donors within the SVP network, but also beyond, and other donors and our alumni to make a solidarity pledge to commit to these more just practices, along with making a gift to make it tangible. So just to summarize, I know I said a lot there, 4 key things. Important lessons for institution building from the Gates perspective is being an advocate and centering solutions on women, trends on building philanthropic institutions that I'm seeing, an accelerated time horizon, excitement that people are starting their philanthropic journey sooner, and the potential growth of more collaborative marketplace of giving vehicles. Third, things I hope to see, more systems change combined with power sharing and trust in those closest to the problem. And the SVP network finally as a leader for future changes in philanthropy. And Alina, I loved your story of Nero and Nero's guests, and really I just so taking that away and thinking that's where SVP partners can just be huge, is really rejecting Nero's way and having a different approach to philanthropy and social problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sofia, for those 4 powerful messages. We'll chat more about it. There are some questions coming up on the chat too. We'll take that towards the end. We now have Vidya Shah, who's the chair and CEO of EdelGive Foundation, a strategic philanthropic organization started about 12 years ago by Vidya. She has channeled the EdelGive structure of giving to include both financial and non-financial support to NGOs, and developed a very unique model of the investees, which EdelGive investees, which places them at the center of the grant making and not providing initial grants to these organizations, not only providing initial grants, but also managing funding from other institutions and corporate partners. This approach has been instrumental in growing over 150 organizations in the last 12 years, scaling their budgets, impact, and reach exponentially. Vidya, would love to have your thoughts on how we can get engaged with philanthropy. I must say that I loved your mantra of not thinking, but just getting to doing things. It's like the Nike slogan, just do it. So over to you, Vidya, to share your perspectives.
Thanks so much, Govind. It's been fascinating to hear all the speakers that we've had before me. I'll just, sort of touch upon my personal journey. I've been in the corporate world for most of my career. I spent the first 11 years in investment banking, and then the next about 7-8 years really being the CFO of EdelGive Group. And a lot of my motivations and learnings actually led to, my experience actually at EdelGive led to the creation of EdelGive Foundation. We are a first generation sort of entrepreneurial firm, EdelGive, which is a financial services group here in India. And when I joined in 2000, I was the 10th employee, so we were a very small firm. I'm also part of the founder group in a sense. And one of our guiding principles was actually to be able to give the moment we started making sustainable profit. And we were 5 years old when I joined. I was the 10th employee. And it actually came to me to actually find a way of doing it. And so I started meeting a lot of nonprofits. I had a mentor in Ramesh Kacholia, who's the founder of Caring Friends, a very interesting group here in Mumbai. And, together we actually started looking at a lot of the nonprofits that they had supported, and I, sort of went along with him. And it was around the time that we were going to go public that I decided to step down as CFO and look at actually setting up this foundation and being with it full time. And I was very lucky to be, to have a board at EdelGive who was very supportive, because remember, this was about 7-8 years before CSR became mandatory, and it was unusual actually for such a young company. We were only 12 years old or so to actually set up a foundation at the time. In the course of those 7 years that I was CFO, I think 2 things happened. One, I realized what it means to grow an organization. We were small, and by the time we went, we IPO'd 7 years after I joined. We were about 1,800 employees from 10 when I joined. And I think this whole this whole balance between capital, technology, people, growth, scale, all of this I learned actually. Governance, compliance, systems, processes, I learned along the way. And the second thing is, in the course of engaging with a lot of nonprofits, it was very clear to me that, a lot of the nonprofits on the ground really struggle with funding. They didn't have, visibility of funding beyond 6 months. But more importantly, they really struggled around capacity, around org development, and around funding of costs behind it. So when we set up the foundation, we said we do both funding and capacity building. And in the initial years, the proposition for EdelGive, and that's why I love the SVP model, was that we wanted our employees to volunteer to provide that capacity building. And that's how we really started. And that was the bridge between the corporate and the foundation. And we've always maintained that this bridge is important. It cannot be sitting outside the corporate doing its own thing. That connection, that bridge is very important. And that's how we've fostered and developed and nurtured that bridge. And that continues to date. So 12 years, 13 years down the line, we have, like you mentioned, supported over 150 organizations with funding and capacity building. Our current portfolio is 43 organizations in the areas of women empowerment, livelihood, but through the lens of water, women, and ecology, and then education. But I think, the learnings I've had along the way, and I just sort of spent 2 minutes talking about it. One is the lens for philanthropy should be a little different for India. For one, I think from a financing point of view, a lot of the wealth that has gotten generated in this country is possibly 20, 25 years old. In the real sense, if you look at the number of rich, young, people. And so I think, the practice of philanthropy is evolving, and it's people like us who are on this group today who need to share our learnings and who need to learn from each other, because we need more people from India supporting Indian causes. The second thing is there's a lot of emphasis on systems change, and I deeply believe in it. A lot of our work is with the government. And we've learned along the way that working with government is easy and it's tough, it's both. And it's really how you try and do it. And when you try and fill gaps in what government can deliver, there's a higher chance that they'll be open and welcoming of your intervention. We've seen that in the largest project we have in education with the government of Maharashtra, where we've actually sat down with them and said, we don't want to step on your toes, but we want to be involved in areas where you are finding it difficult to get things done. And I think that partnership approach with government is very, very essential. And the third thing is, as an independent nation, we are not even 75 years old. A lot of the institutions that exist are actually a legacy of the British. And these institutions are young, they are not as strong enough. And therefore, there's philanthropy also in India has to support the development of institutions, whether it's schools of public policy, whether it's institutions of research and academia that support a lot more studies and research of both measurement as well as the practice of philanthropy itself, whether it's academic institutions like Ashoka University. I think we have to have a balance between supporting nonprofits on the ground, especially the small and medium that do not get the attention of philanthropy, but also we have to focus on building the institutions that can take us forward. Thanks, Govind.
Thank you. Thanks, Vidya, for that. So we've got about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to try and do 2 questions and then hand it back to Ganesh. One question that's come up since the morning, and Sofia, I think you referred to it a little bit. In the morning, one of the SVP partners raised the question, how do you start giving earlier? Most of us start thinking of giving when we retire or otherwise. Sanjeev had asked that question. And even Deepak's put a question today on the chat group. How should people think about giving time and our money to have a career in giving? What are some of the guidelines here, and what are some of your experiences? And Sofia, I would love for you to take it. And Paul, if you can also feature this question, how you've got SVP partners over the world to start coming in earlier. So over to you, Sofia, first.
How do we get people to start giving their time and their money earlier in life? And I said this earlier, I mean, I think it's happening. I think there's a younger generation that is very, at least what I see in the US, is very motivated thinking about social impact and making career choices and companies they'll work for, oftentimes with what's the social impact of this company in mind. So, one thing I would just say, and kind of builds on Paul's point about leadership, is I do think we need to have corporate leaders who are thinking about their social impact and communicating to their employee base too, and having, just kind of what is the value that their corporation has to society? Do they support their employees to get involved in the community? Would be a question for corporate leaders. I also think there's an importance around the social narrative. Do we value people who choose professions in philanthropy and teaching in health or not? The Teach for India example is a great one, really supporting people who have probably a lot of options in their careers to really value them entering the field of teaching. They have a lot of choices, the highly talented people. How are we making it philanthropy a career that's seen as a competitive career alongside finance and some other types of career? And then finally, I think it's SVP and organizations like SVP have a role to play in terms of giving folks opportunities to volunteer. And again, maybe thinking also with a younger audience in mind where they may be not at the point of retirement. So how do you make volunteer roles flexible for people who are also working and want to give, maybe have less time? When can they volunteer, and how they can maybe do things in groups to build a community of practice to contribute ultimately to a cause. So those are just some ideas I have.
So, Paul, any perspectives you'd like to share?
Yeah, real briefly. So it's so interesting to hear you ask that question of how to get people to give earlier in life. That is exactly the question that a whole bunch of people in Seattle sat around asking in 1997. Sincerely. And that's part of what led to the creation of SVP. So I'll say two things real quick that I think are answers to this. And they are embodied in what SVP is. So, and to start, this is not about the amount of money. Don't get stuck on the amount of money. Number one, get engaged beyond your money with your time, your skills, your networks, your talents, just along the lines of some of the stories you've heard here today. Again, that's what the SVP model is. That's part of why we designed it that way. But getting engaged besides or in addition to your money, that actually leads you to give more money. And secondly, do it with other people. SVP is explicitly a network, and we know that when we connect people together, not only do they get more satisfaction out of the experience, that also leads them to give more and to give more generously. So engage beyond your money, because that will lead to more money, and do it with others and form a peer network that will also engage you or encourage you to give earlier in life.
Thank you very much. And last question that's really for Anu. Anu, you shared a lot of the experience you've had over the last 50 years of education, and I know you're a strong believer that education is one of the factors that will bring more equality to this world. The question I have is really, Teach for India and Akanksha have self-built leaders. What's led to the success of Teach for India and Akanksha in attracting such outstanding people? And for other NGOs who are, we are supporting and that are on this call, what can we learn from that experience?
I think one of the things is the passion of the founder. It's infectious. When I met Shaheen, who started Akanksha and Teach for India, I got so inspired. So it rubs on you, that passion. Then holding yourself to very high standards. You don't just say something, but you consistently deliver high standard. And the impact it has on children. So many of our kids have joined Ashoka, Kriya, have been accepted by UWC. So the impact it has on the children. So I think if you are authentic, as Paul said, as a leader, it does attract. other people to join.
Thank you. Well, Ganesh, over to you. Thank you very, very much to the panelists and all their contributions. And sorry we're out of time, but I'll hand it back to Ganesh to the needful.